Welcome to Africa's Vision Network. My name is Omar Ashaka, your guest host. The title of our program is Driving to Stay Healthy and Alive. Our special guest is Mr. Rodney Hollins, founder of Hollins Security Consulting, LLC. Welcome, Rodney.
Thank you.
Africa's Vision Network is so grateful to have you on our program because our topic of discussion is a critical one, and we're really looking forward to your insight. Why don't we start off by you sharing with our audience some of your background that inspired you to initiate your Drive Safe, Stay Safe program?
The purpose of this brochure is basically about what's been going on throughout our nation, how men of color have been shot and killed by police officers throughout the country. And the brochure goes into details of what we can do, African American men of color or of color can do to prevent this from happening.
Okay. What about your background, Rodney? I know you've been in law enforcement for quite a period of time. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
My law enforcement experience is 34 years. I was on Metropolitan Police Department for 25 years. And I got promoted as a detective in 1994. I did 9 years with the United States Capitol Police, basically doing the same thing I'm doing now. I mean, as an officer and as a detective.
Okay. Why do you feel that Rodney was identified to be the drum major for a program such as Drive Safe, Stay Safe? Why Rodney?
Basically, again, is what we have learned over the years of police officer shootings, doing traffic stops, a shooting that could have been avoided, a shooting that I believe that if men of color, if they knew or have some kind of experience to know what they can do to prevent this from happening.
Let me ask you this though, Rodney. What about, was there any godly inspiration for you to do this? And the reason I'm saying this too, because as we get into this discussion, you may be exposing some things, and clearly we're not here to bash police officers. We're here to speak the truth, and we're here to try to find solutions that can help us with this critical issue of police shootings and killings. So I'm just curious, because to even have a desire to do this, there must be some compassion in your heart as well.
There's a lot of compassion. I have a 23-year-old black male son, and most of these shootings occur between the ages of 18 and 29. And I believe that I need to get that message out, just so that everyone will have an idea of what they can do, again, for keeping the tragedy from happening to our young men of color.
Okay. Rodney, when you were a police officer and a detective, were you ever stopped by the police?
Yes. Not only in Washington, D.C., but in other states.
Can you share with our audience a little bit about what that experience was like, being a police officer and then being stopped?
First, I highly recommend that your audience do not do what I actually done when I got pulled over. And that's only because I know the lingo of police officer and how they're supposed to approach the vehicle. Some of the negative stuff about getting pulled over by police officers, not only in D.C., but out of state, it's the vehicles I drive. During that time, I drove a luxury vehicle, and apparently it brought attention to officers out of state, and particularly in North Carolina.
Okay. Now that, I have to raise the question, is that part of the training, to pull over luxury vehicles?
I believe it's not part of the training. I think most of these police officers are actually profiling. Black men with driving luxury cars, they automatically assume that I might be a possibly drug dealer or a mule. A mule is a person who drives drugs from one state to the other.
But that still goes back to my question about the training. How does profiling fit into police training? Or is that something that the officers are doing on their own, independent of the training?
Profiling doesn't fit into police training at all. This is something the officers have done on their own negative stereotyping of Afro-American men and people of color.
Okay. Well, Rodney, again, our program title is called Driving to Stay Healthy, to Arrive Alive. As I may have mentioned to you during our communication before the show, I added healthy because there are those who may have arrived to their destination alive, but maybe they were shot or maybe they were beaten. So that's why I added healthy and alive. So let's discuss, Rodney, some of the specifics of your program, Drive Safe, Stop Safe. I'm sorry, Drive Safe, Stay Safe. And I'll let you kind of start wherever you want to start. And I have a few notes that I'll ask a couple of questions.
Well, the brochure itself is only 12 pages long, and that's by design. I decided to keep it short, so my readers wouldn't lose interest in reading the brochure itself. It goes into details of responsibility of the driver, responsibility of the passengers, and responsibility of the driver himself or herself is that when he or she get pulled over by the police, there's certain procedures that he or she should take when he get pulled over, such as keeping his or her hands on the steering wheel. If it's at nighttime, turn on your dome light. Your passenger and the front seat passenger should keep his or her hands on the dashboard.
Okay, Rodney, let me play devil's advocate with something you just said, though. Just to be clear, when you said the dome light, I guess I'm kind of imagining that I'm reaching up to turn that light on. That's not something that might scare or spook or cause some reaction from the police officer that maybe I don't want to.
Well,
I'm just
when I say turn the dome light on, this is actually before you actually stop.
Okay,
The
good.
driver actually see the red flashing lights
Okay.
coming in the rear. So I recommended that, if he's going to do anything such as getting his driver license in his purse or in the glove compartment, you normally do this before the car
Okay.
actually stops. So
Okay.
you turn on your dome light to let the officer know, okay, I see you, you're behind me. And that let the officer know too.
So when a driver turns on that light prior to the officer approaching him, that should be a positive for that driver in terms of the officer seeing that the light is being placed
That should be positive for the officer.
for the officer. Okay.
When I mean by playing positive, the officer know that he has a better insight of the vehicle because the light is on. The police officer trained in the academy that hands kill. Hands kill. If police officer can see your hand, you're no threat to them, or you'll lessen your chance of being threatened. As long as the police officer can see your hands, that's a good sign. Police officer see you turn on that dome light, he knows you are assisting him in seeing those hands.
Okay, that's a great point. Number 2, you have here, obey the police officer's instructions. Let's talk about that a little bit.
What I mean by obeying the officer's instructions, before the officer approach the vehicle, again, have the dome light on and have your window wind down. Do not reach for anything like your driver license. If you haven't gotten your driver license out or your registration out prior to being stopped, wait for the officer to give you instruction to obtain or get your driver license, so he know where you're reaching for.
Okay. And again, let's talk about, because this kind of leads into number 3, it says drivers are responsible for their passengers and all vehicle contents. Let's talk about the passengers. Let's say it's a situation where the driver has a front passenger and maybe a couple in the back, especially in terms of those in the back, in terms of showing their hands or whatever they need to do.
The passenger in the rear should keep their hands on the headrest of the driver. If there's a passenger in the rear of the driver, his or her hands should be on that driver headrest. If he's sitting in the rear, that goes for the other passenger also. The front seat passenger should keep his or her hands on the dashboard.
For how long?
Until the police officers feel safe. Again, we talk about hands again. As long as the police officers see where your hands are, you're not reaching for any type of weapon or they're going to do any bodily harm to that officer.
Sounds like that means maybe until the officer walks away, the passengers should keep their hands where
Yes.
they can be seen.
Yes.
Okay. When you say drivers are responsible for their passengers, are there any other points that you want to highlight as to what responsibility drivers have for their passengers?
If a particular driver is pulled over by the police, the driver should do all the talking, not the passengers. Remember, the driver is the one that's being pulled over. So when a police officer approaches the driver, he or she is doing all the talking to the police officer. Passengers is to stay quiet. No sudden movement or any sort like that.
In your experience, are there any situations where the police officer might want to question the passengers?
No, not necessarily. Again, the driver is the reason why the police officer pulled him over.
Okay, so in theory then, there should be no need for a police officer to ask passengers for their identification.
No, unless there's if there's a particular reason the vehicle fit the description of a robbery. And the description comes out as such a type of vehicle occupied by 4 black males or 4 occupants, and one of those occupants may be a robber. He go by the name of Joe Johnson. We want to know who the passengers in the rear seat to make sure Joe Johnson is one of those passengers.
Okay. Now, I know you have a lot of experience. I think you mentioned total about 34 years of experience. Today, and maybe in the past, are there typically now 2 officers stopping a vehicle, or is it 1? It just depends on the jurisdiction, or there's no
Most
set?
in Washington D.C., we normally have 2 officers normally approach the vehicle. In some jurisdictions, you might like state troopers. They're alone on state highways by themselves, so there might be one officer conducting a traffic stop. But in Washington D.C., we normally like to have 2 officers, one on the driver's side and one on the passenger side.
What's the rationale behind that?
Safety
For the officers?
for the officers. The officer who's normally asking a question to the driver can listen and concentrate on the driver and look at the passengers at the same time.
Okay. Typically, Rodney, when a vehicle is stopped, excuse me, is the police officer's hand on this handgun, or unless there's, yeah, I guess that's the question.
I think yes. Yes, I think there's no most vehicles when they approach a vehicle, the officer doesn't know what he or she getting him or herself into. You have to remember too, what I mean by that, police officer there just to conduct a regular traffic stop. The passenger may think that the officer know he just robbed the bank. So the advantage goes to the passengers because the officer doesn't know what they have just done might have been a felony or a crime. Police officer just stopped that vehicle just because the tail light was out.
Okay. So that's good information to know that, excuse me, typically if there's a stop, a police officer is going to maybe have his hand on the gun, and maybe, excuse me, we shouldn't take it personal, but that's just part of the training and safety.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Another topic in your Drive Safe, Stay Safe brochure, number 4, no confrontations. Talk to us about that.
What I mean by no confrontation, I believe most of our men of color are being shot because they become confrontational, or the police officer believes they're becoming a threat to them. If you believe a police officer is violating your rights, your civil rights, file a complaint. In my brochure, it talks about live another day. And that specifically means that, do not become confrontational. Get the police officer's name and badge number, and the most important, follow up on that complaint.
Okay, now you mentioned something very interesting. Excuse me, you mentioned a badge number. Especially if it's someone being stopped at night, how visible is that? And does the driver have the right to say, "Officer, may I have your badge number?"
Yes.
And the officer has to comply, or?
Yes. And his name. That's why we I know in Washington D.C. When we approach a vehicle on the traffic stop, we identify ourselves. Example, I'm Officer Jackson from the Metropolitan Police Department. I stopped you because your tail light was out. May I have your registration and your driver license?
Saying, when an officer says, is it mandatory that an officer state why they're stopping someone?
If mandatory, I'm not too sure if it's mandatory, but at the police academy, those are the procedures we normally go by, and if I consider mandatory.
Okay.
I think the driver has the right to know why you pulled them over.
Okay, Rodney, for the drivers who might be watching, as well as myself and others, is there different behavior that's required for daytime driving opposed to nighttime driving? Are there any extra precautions that might be required or recommended driving during the day opposed to driving at night?
I think the rule changes at night. Police have a difficult time seeing the passengers' hands. That's why I recommended that the driver, turn on the dome light, place their hands where the officer can see them. So there's a difference between the daytime driving and a traffic stop versus traffic stop during the night.
Yeah, and Rodney, this might be a good time. Excuse me, I know before when you and I were talking, setting up this interview, I think I mentioned to you an experience I had in Charles County, Maryland. I had a BMW diesel, and that diesel fuel covered the light, the brake light. And as I was driving down the road, the police officer pulled me over, Charles County Sheriff, and I got to admit I did something very stupid because I just jumped out the car because I'm wondering, why is he stopping me? And obviously I was blessed because what the officer said, he was still in his car, but he said, get back in that car. But you know, when you haven't been stopped, I had another experience, but I guess I just kind of reacted and hopped out of the car. So this is why this discussion is so critical and so helpful, because I didn't think me jumping out of the car, he could think that I have a gun or something and blow me away. And if he's one of those biased officers, I didn't have to have anything in my hand. He could have blown me away. So I was blessed. So, excuse me, that's why this program is really great. But let me ask you this. I want to go back to confrontation. What about a scenario, Rodney, where a driver feels that the police officer is being a little unfair, and so the driver decides to say, I'd like for you to call your supervisor?
Well, sometimes that happens a lot, but sometimes a supervisor may not be available. If you're a state trooper and your supervisor might be 25 miles away. In the city of District of Columbia, it may be local, may be not too far away. So again, I just recommend the officer or the passenger get the police officer name, get his badge number, and go. And you don't. And if something happened in Washington D.C., if you file a complaint, if you believe that you can't file a complaint in that particular jurisdiction or 7th district or 5th district, you can be able to file that complaint in any jurisdiction and follow up on it.
How polite does one have to be if a driver wants someone to get their supervisor? Do they necessarily have to say, can you get your supervisor, please? Or can they just say, can you get your supervisor? And that may sound like a silly question, but
I think the second option, can you get your supervisor? And then let that officer tell you, again, he's not available, this and that and that. You file that in, you put that in your complaint.
Okay.
You requested a supervisor. The officer stated that none was available. And let the police officer follow up in their investigation to finding out what supervisor was available and where was he for that officer to say that he wasn't available.
suppose an officer responds by saying, if you say please, can you get a supervisor? Then I'll call the supervisor.
I think, again, that can be a matter between the police officers playing on words now.
Right, but I'm the driver. Because
Mhm.
I'm feeling a little bit of harassment now because you're saying I should say please. You're saying that you only call a supervisor if I say please.
If it was, I would recommend that you feel whatever you feel comfortable, whatever that the driver feel comfortable in taking the next level to whatever his or her complaint is going to be. If that's what he or she wants to do, I'm talking about the driver, so be it. But if he or she doesn't want to do that, it's okay too.
Okay. And let me just say that, I mean, that's a real situation, because when I was doing my research for this program, I actually saw a YouTube video of that occurring, whereby the driver, he was concerned as to why the police officer stopped him, so he asked for a supervisor, and the recording, the police officer saying, "If you say please," and of course the driver said, "No, I'm not going to say please." But let me move on to another example I shared with you. My experience: I was driving to Atlanta, Georgia, and I was pulled over in South Carolina, and I guess my tail light was out. And this was interesting because that situation, the police officer had me to get in his cruiser, and I sat up front, and I'll never forget, he had this big shotgun between us, and when I gave him my license, you may remember I told you this, he said, "Oh, got myself a birthday boy here." And look, I'm a grown man then. Of course, that shotgun was a good reminder to me that I had to be cool. But my point, Rodney, we want to show respect to police officers, but help us out in the audience. When you have that kind of, I'm pretty certain that is not what people are trained to do when they have their training. But when drivers have to, especially African American drivers, and any driver, you have to deal with that kind of insult.
When every state had their own rules as far as traffic stop, but mostly of it should be universal. We don't have that I can ever remember have a driver in the front seat of our vehicle. We'll prefer the vehicle. We would prefer the driver stays and heads to her vehicle while I go back to my vehicle, and I might run the tags to make sure that it's not wanted or it's not stolen. The vehicle's not stolen. But we normally don't have vehicles. We don't have passengers in our front seat of our vehicles.
Okay, interesting. Next question I'm going to move on to, a next topic you had, so our audience will be familiar with drive safe, stay safe. Let me make a correction. Drive safe, stop safe. Number 6, if over 16 years of age, have valid identification. I mean, that almost sounds like that's kind of a basic, Rodney, but you have it here.
I believe that if you have a driver license or some sort of in DC you have a non-driver license, you want to make sure you don't want to give the police officer any reason to detain you any further. Have a valid driver license to determine who you are as a person. Police officer say, "I'm looking for John Doe." Well, I'm not John Doe. Here's my driver license. If a person was involved in a robbery or shooting or something like that, and the person cannot identify themselves, I'm not sure who you are as a person. I might have to detain you until I can find out exactly who you are. And if you can cut down on those odds by having your identification, you should be able to let go. You should be able to be free to go.
Okay. Number 7, you have here, know your friends or the company you keep.
Sometime a driver has access to a vehicle, and he picks up some of his friends that he may not grew up with, somebody he just went to school with. And the driver's not aware that that person was just committed offense, a crime. Now he has a particular person in his vehicle with him. The police officer's gonna think he's involved also. So it goes back to know who your friends are. And when I know who your friends are, you should know whether or not the company you keep or the person you might have in your car may not be a stand-up kind of guy.
Now, Rodney, for the young people that might be watching the program, did you experience that often or frequently when you were a police officer, people having friends in the car that maybe had done something or?
Well, sometime as a as a uniformed guy, yes. I may have conducted a traffic stop, and the traffic stop may have been because he or she ran the stop sign. And when I approach the vehicle, it's a driver, a passenger, and maybe 2 additional drivers in the back. So that can be a problem. As far as knowing as an officer, not knowing who these people are in the rear seat. Did that answer? Did that answer
Right,
your
right.
question?
Okay. Well, let me go to number 8. Now, this is an interesting one. Know your constitutional rights. Illegal search. When I read this one, Rodney, I thought about frequently I see young African American men sitting on the curb, handcuffed, and I see police going through their cars. I can't help but wonder how frequently are they illegal searches, and maybe those young men may not even know that it's illegal. Just a thought I had.
I think that that's the reason why that question and those answers is in the brochure, because sometimes a police officer will pull you over if you're in a traffic violation, and the police officer say, "Well, I'm gonna give you a warning." Just suppose he says, "I'm gonna give you a warning this time," and then he'll say, and I'm saying this because this is actually happening in real time. I'm giving you a warning this time. Here's your driver's license, here's your registration, here's your proof of insurance. I'm giving it back to you. By the way, can I search your vehicle? The answer is no. This is going back to your constitutional rights again. For you to search my vehicle, you need a warrant, you need a search warrant. So if a police officer asks, "Can I search your vehicle?" you say no, and then officer, and this is real time. This happened in real. They'll say, "Well, if you're not hiding anything, let me search your vehicle." And the answer is still no. Now the illegal part comes in at when he say, "Oh, well, I'm gonna have the drug dogs or the gun dogs search your vehicle." Now I'm being illegally detained against my will, because first you passed me on to saying that you gave me a warning. Don't forget the initial stop, because it was a traffic stop. Now the officer elevated to a point that he wants to search my car, the trunk and the glove compartment, whether or not it's locked or unlocked. The answer is no, not without a search warrant. Now he been illegally detained.
I want to go back to, you mentioned though, a drug dog. I'm sorry, does that mean that they can do that without your permission, or they still need a search warrant with a drug dog?
If what you mean, if they're gonna come over and stop you?
Well, let's say there's a dog in the car, a drug dog, and the driver said, "No, you can't search my car without a warrant." But I heard you mention the drug dogs, and I just wanted to know, is that an exception to the
It is exception, especially if the drug dog is not in the present right now with you, or with the unit, or with the police officer, and the driver have to wait until the drug dog comes to the scene.
Illegal.
It's illegal. Now you're being illegally detained. Why? You just told me that I was cleared to go. Now I have to wait until a drug dog comes. Why?
Again, Rodney, with your many years of experience, though, with drivers saying, "No, you can't search my car," do we have any statistics as to whether or not that has escalated into police brutality?
I'm not sure whether or not if it has, it'd probably be the Department of Justice or the FBI would probably keep those statistics about that question.
Okay. Now, Rodney, you mentioned something that I had not heard of, if I heard you correctly. Did you say there was a gun dog?
Yeah, we had MPD had vehicle dogs that are trained in sniffing out weapons in the vehicle. We have dogs that if a suspect or a person discard a gun into the woods or something, we have dogs that actually sniff that out to find a weapon. Same thing about a vehicle, same as a gun being inside of a vehicle. The dogs are trained for that particular purpose.
Ronnie, I think this might be a good time for me to start asking some of my questions that I have, but I do want to talk briefly about the complaint form, because as you know, some people, they might be a little intimidated by even basic forms, but because of the importance of filing this complaint form, can you talk a little bit more about that and how critical that is?
It's very critical. It's critical to the point where if you don't feel comfortable filling out that complaint form in the police station, take it home. Make yourself feel comfortable in your environment, in your kitchen table. Fill it out, and bring it back to the police station. The police officer's still gonna be there.
And for those who might think, well, look, I file a complaint, nothing's going to happen. What do you say to those people? Individuals.
I totally disagree with that, because your complaint may be the one that put this police officer on notice that he been doing some of this shady type of policing that need to be addressed. Your complaint, the person who filled out a complaint doesn't know that this officer may have had several complaints against him or her in the past. Yours might be the one that they actually need to really look into. You'll be the one that may stop this officer from doing some illegal or unnecessary shooting against or even breaking the law.
Okay. And Rodney, because I know time is moving on, I'm going to raise a couple other questions before I get to my list. And you and I may have talked a little bit about this because it's in reference to the Archie Elliott III police shooting in Maryland. He only had a pair of pants on. They claim he had a gun. And supposedly what I was shared by the mom, because she was actually on our show, the police officer that killed him, he has killed twice in the county, and he's still on the force. From your experience, and even as a father of a 23-year-old, I guess the question is, why would a police officer who's killed 2 citizens be allowed to be on the police force? Granted, he was not charged, from what I understand. But is it fair to the community, in your opinion, when you have someone who has killed twice and he's still policing in the community?
That's something that's up to that particular police agency. Maybe the shooting that maybe the first shooting was justifiable. Just because the officer was involved in two shootings doesn't make him guilty of anything. He was cleared by the Department of Justice. He may have been cleared by the court system. He may have been cleared by internal affairs or the police officer. A charge was brought up against that person. He was cleared. We just can't count shooting because the police officer been involved in a shooting that he was always wrong. We have a system here, and he may have been cleared. It might have been justifiable shooting.
Well, and you have a good point about perhaps it could be justifiable. And I'm not, from my perspective, I'm not saying that the person should necessarily be fired. And granted, again, if he went to the courts and maybe they've cleared him. But my point is, let me ask you this, Rodney. I want to be, because I said I was going to be a straight shooter with you. You were on the police for about 34 years, detective police officer. How many times do you recall firing your gun?
Never. I mean, other than going through the range, but I never actually, I pulled my weapon out hundreds of times, but I have never actually shot my weapon at a person.
Well, see, Rodney, this is why this subject is just so fascinating to me and the psychology behind it. Here you, as a police officer, and I know everybody's different, 34 years of experience, and you never shot anybody?
But that shouldn't be unusual. Personally, I don't think it's unusual. I think police officers on many jurisdictions have been on department and they never actually discharged their weapon before.
And that kind of, and I'm kind of smiling because, see, that kind of makes my point. When there's an officer, and I don't know the time frame in terms of these 2 people that were killed, because you said that should be kind of like the normal, not maybe firing it, but. And I know as citizens we have to talk to our politicians, because like I said, I'm not saying that the person, especially if it wasn't proven that he was wrong, I'm not saying it should be fired, but maybe he should be taken off the street. But at any rate, let me go with some of my questions that I had, Rodney. And I think we were kind of talking about this off camera. Are certain model, and you may have mentioned it with the car you were driving, are certain model and make vehicles targeted consciously or subconsciously by police officers? And
I believe it's subconsciously. I believe some of these vehicles, what we call profiling. Police officers knows the type of vehicle the African American men have a tendency to drive, and they are actually profiling. Some of the vehicles that may be very popular in African American communities. Police officer believes a black male or a person of color is driving it.
Now, that makes it interesting too. So if there's a good-looking car driven by an African American, that same car driven by somebody who's not African American, are we suggesting that maybe the probability is that that person who's not African American will not be stopped and they can enjoy their vehicle?
Yes. Statistic has it that 2.5, but there's a 2.5% chance of African American men are being shot compared to white American being shot.
Well, and I'm kind of jumping around, but that ties into some of the research I did last night, and it talked about implicit bias. And I guess the way I would describe it shortly, it talked about prejudging, being prejudiced. An example that I would use is, and I've used this on the show before, if I'm walking down a street and I see 4 pit bulls, I'm going to have a certain reaction. Matter of fact, I used this example with my 17-year-old daughter last night. I said, if you're riding your bike or walking down the street and you see 4 pit bulls, you know, it's funny, even before I finished my statement, she said, they're going to bite me? And that is kind of like an example of implicit bias with some people. They see black folks, just like you're saying, they think that they may be robbed, they're dangerous. And this implicit bias is so fascinating because they even talked about how that bias can be so deep that officers can see a person may have a cell phone, but because of this implicit bias, they think gun. And as you know, as an officer, they talk about milliseconds in terms of making a decision. But it's really, that's why this program, I think, is so needed, because it's a very, very serious issue. And when you get to the psychology behind what's going on with these officers, and that's why I salute you, Rodney, because what you're doing can help save lives. Let me go to the next question. What's the percentage of police shootings, killings conducted by male police officers versus female police officers?
To me,
To Bessie
that
and
probably is a stat that the Department of Justice will keep, and the FBI. I don't think that probably my best answer that we had, who actually had that statistic, the FBI or Department of Justice.
Okay. Are there statistics kept on police shooting victims, such as their height, weight, complexion / race, or type of clothing worn? And I can explain it a little bit further if you like. But
Yes.
I was always curious, especially after killing and even a shooting, do they, when the report is written, is data kind of compiled? And I know money is usually involved, and so the answer might be no. But is data compiled so we know that, okay, the typical person that's being shot is 6 whatever and 6'5", dark complexion, wearing a hoodie, or blah, blah, blah?
I don't think there's, if it is one that exists, again, it'd probably be the Department of Justice.
Okay.
That would hold a statistic like that. Like I mentioned you earlier, there's a statistic that says, like I mentioned, that black African American men are 2 times more likely to get shot by police officers than their white people, than the white counter or the white Americans.
Okay. These police shootings and killings, Rodney, is it typically a situation where there's only one person, the driver in the vehicle, or do you have situations where there might be other occupants in there as well? I was just curious, was it solo situations with drivers only? And
That again,
probably.
that's probably something that Department of Justice, FBI would actually, because there has been shooting that has been involved just a single driver. As you may be aware of it, down in Mississippi, there was a young man that was shot. He was the driver that was actually shot. He wasn't occupied with other passengers. He happened to be the only one.
And you're right, I am aware of others, because there was one right up here in Virginia, Alexandria, and this gentleman I believe he was a graduate from Hampton University. It was shocking.
Yes.
And this was a state trooper killing. The typical number of gunshots required to end a perceived threat to a police officer from a solo driver. And I want to tie this into something you said, you talked about in your book. You talked about confrontation. And I wanted to ask you, are we talking about verbal confrontation or physical confrontation? Because again, if a driver is sitting in the car, when you talk about confrontation, are you talking about both physical, verbal, or?
I think I'm starting off talking verbal.
Verbal, okay.
I'm talking about verbal confrontation. Verbal would lead them to the physical part later.
Okay.
The confrontation normally starts verbally, then it escalates to a physical part. When I say, hey, don't become confrontational, yes, officer, or officer, give me a ticket, whatever you're going to do so I can proceed on. But get that officer name. You want to file it. If you believe you've been violated, get this officer name and file a complaint.
Now, I want to stay with confrontation just a few more seconds. If the police officer has identified that the driver does not have a gun, how then does the officer become and feel threatened?
But if, again, that's an individual thing with the officer, he must have saw something in the vehicle or something like that nature. If an officer asks you to get out the vehicle, you must get out. You must exit the vehicle. Normally, when he asks you to exit the vehicle, he may see something that might be threatening to him, that maybe the driver might not be aware of. It goes back to the topic about know your passenger, know your passenger, know who you picking in your vehicle. The driver might not be aware that there's a butt of a gun sticking out of underneath the seat. So he asks all the passengers to exit the vehicle. A lot of our males, or a lot of our men of color believe that they don't have to exit the vehicle. But a police officer asks you to exit the vehicle, you must exit the vehicle, and it states in the brochure, there's a ruling, there's a Supreme Court ruling on that topic. If an officer asks you to exit the vehicle.
Does the driver have the right to say why?
Yes.
Why do you want to? Okay, and the police should respond with
the police officer could say whatever he feels. He doesn't have to say, because I see a gun underneath the seat.
Right.
Sir, will you please exit the vehicle? Sir, exit the vehicle. And he may say, why I need to exit the vehicle. The officer he can take it to a level where, sir, I'll tell you why when you exit the vehicle.
Okay, all right. Here's the next one, Rodney. We kind of talked about this, I think. In those jurisdictions where cameras are required by police officers, at what point should the camera be turned on for a traffic stop?
The camera should be turned on anytime an officer is confronted by a citizen. It's for the citizen protection, also for the officer protection. When I mean confronted, if you're having a dialogue with a citizen, turn your camera on. That dialogue can be very negative very quickly, and you wanted to capture it from the beginning to the end if it decided to go in a different direction. It can be from polite to some hostile type situation.
Now, how can the driver and the occupants identify whether or not a police officer's camera is actually on?
Most that I know of, most of the camera has a red light on it. It indicates that the conversation and audio and visual is being recorded.
Okay. So Rodney, we know in a number of situations, at least according to the media, for some strange reason, cameras seem to be turned off at almost perhaps a critical point of time during a crisis.
Is it turned off or was never turned on? It's
Okay.
a difference. If it was never turned on, I just think that can go many ways. The camera is a new tool that police officers are using now, so it's something they have to get used to. Remember, turn my camera on, turn my camera off, turn my camera on, turn my camera off. So now I think officers now are finally getting used to it's coming a habit now, is to turn that camera on. But to turn it off, there's a difference between turning it on and actually not turning it or turning it off intentionally.
And that's a good point, Rodney. And let me just say that one of the things that we're going to do with this show, we're going to do something a little differently. And that's assuming I get to let me just say this too. That's assuming I get the permission from our esteemed producer, Miss Gloria Fleming. But here's the question that I have for you, Rodney. With things being so bad, I think it's time for citizens to start wearing cameras. And that's going to be one of the questions I'm going to have at the end of the show. I want to see those viewers get their feedback.
They already have cameras.
Well, but I'm not talking about, you talking about the phones?
Yeah, they video police situation all the time.
Right, no, you're right, and thank God for that. But no, I'm talking about the driver. Because obviously I can't, if I'm stopped by a police officer, I'm not going to be able to, the worst thing I want to do, I'm assuming to get my cell phone. But no, I'm talking about some kind of the same type of camera that police officers wear, maybe something tailored a little bit differently. And I know I mentioned to some people, they kind of laughed. But these killings, you know, they talk about the Second Amendment, protect the Second Amendment. People want their guns. We have airbags. What are the reasons? We know what's the rationale for an airbag? It's to keep you safe. And so if some kind of camera that citizens can have and that they are protected from police officers in the sense that a police officer can't say turn it off. Now, I'm not naive. I know this means, you know, going through state governments, federal governments, but I wanted to plant that seed. You know, you and I were talking on the phone. I didn't want to say it over the phone. I wanted it to be heard first on Africa's Vision Network. I believe in thinking out of the box. I have a 2-year-old grandson. You have a 23-year-old son. I think they said, statistics said that 104 unarmed black men, I think they said were shot during the course of a year, which I think it equated to maybe 2 a day. So what I'm trying to say with this show too, in this program, is that this is no joke. People are dying innocently. Now let me just say too, and then we'll get back to my questions. I have tremendous respect for police officers who are doing the right thing. Somebody break in my house or harm any of my family members, who am I going to call? I'm going to call the police. But I want to use a quote that President Donald Trump's attorney used, Giuliani. He said that there are bad guys in the FBI. And this is very recently. He said there are bad guys in the Department of Justice. And so my focus here with this program is not on the good cops who are doing, police who are doing their duty like you, because like you said, you've helped people, even in arresting them. I'm not talking about those kind of police, but I'm talking about the bad cops. And if you got the president's attorney, former mayor of New York City, can say, you got bad guys in the FBI, you got bad guys in the Department of Justice, why is this pushback and this resistance when people say they're bad police officers?
For him to say that he's a bad person himself, a bad person would say something like what he just quoted as saying or just said. You'll hear something like that from a suspect who's been arrested by the police officer, and the first thing he will cry out, foul. My rights wasn't read to me, knowing that his rights was read to him. And it's the people like the mayor of New York, if he says like that, he's on a personal mission to represent his client.
Right, and I just use that as an example because we got bad people in all employment circumstances. But I'm just saying sometimes there's that resistance. And let me use the example of the unfortunate shooting of Walter Scott in, I think, North Carolina.
North Carolina.
I mean, and thank God for the recording. Because that was like saying he was not treated like a human, he was treated like an animal. He could hardly run. And yet I know they found him guilty, I believe, but I know that there was some resistance. They were still trying to cover it up to justify that kind of cruel shooting. But I just got a cue that time is moving on. But I do want to ask you one other question key question on my list to you. And I asked the question, are police trained to handle fear?
Wow.
And I like that you gave me a little smile on that one.
Train for fear. I believe each officer has their own what they consider fear. Again, every day when a police officer puts on his uniform, he or she doesn't know when he's gonna come home or not. So if there's a lot of bad people out here who doesn't like the police, but that's a profession that we chose.
Right, but Rodney, real quick, I want to go back to, and when I say are they trained, I'm just curious, in the training of police officers, is there a discussion on how to handle fear?
Not in my 34 years of training.
And the reason I'm saying that again, real quick, I'll read this. There was a recent report on NPR indicating that part of the problem with police violence against citizens is born of officers' fear. There's a Dr. Gordon Muskowski or something like that, chair of the psychology department of Lehigh University. He said that, let me read this. He said, his studies illustrate how fear might lead one to act with discrimination without realizing one's reaction is biased. And he also talked, because I know time is moving on, so I won't read all of this, because he talked about this implicit bias. You see a big, tall black man, strong, athletic.
Mm-hmm.
So, and maybe a little further down the road, or maybe we'll see more information. I was always curious, are police trained to deal with fear? It reminds me too, and this may not apply, I saw a show where this guy had been bullied in high school. He was a little skinny, thin guy. But after he got out of high school, he started bulking up. He was working out. And on this show, they had some of the bullies, some of the students who used to bully him in high school to come on the show. And this guy was ready to go and just pound on him. I'm trying to use an analogy that I always wish that I could see the video of many police officers' early childhood and maybe middle school, high school, to see what kind of students they were. Were they picked on? And I'm kind of being a little scattered here with my thoughts, but I just thought it was fascinating when I read this article by this particular doctor that talked about some of this bias is because police officers are fearful of African American men. But Rodney, as we get ready to, I know we don't have but a few more minutes because I do want to say something about the individuals who were killed in Santa Fe. So I want to give you a few minutes to
Santa Fe,
Texas, the
Okay.
10 people who died, school shooting. But Rodney, I want to give you these last few minutes before I do that to share with our audience what you think is so very important, apart from what you've already said, in order for them to arrive home alive. Any other things that come to mind that you might want to share?
Most of the shooting that occurred in our nation has been because most of our men of color may have become confrontations with the officers, challenging the officer's authority, which is I have no problem with someone challenging someone's authority. My problem comes in that it can lead to death. You talk about fear. Don't forget, police officers are human beings just like everyone else. We have fear. We marry. We have children. We just like everyone else. So if things escalate to a point that I recommend that our men of color or African American or anyone file a complaint. At least you lived another day to file a complaint. These our young men are being shot and killed at a rapid pace. Let's do something about it.
Okay, Rodney, the time is really it's gone pretty much. I just want to thank you very much. And can you quickly say though, when African American police officers see so many African Americans shot and killed, and I know you are an officer, but is there any kind of mental anguish that you have when that happens? Because you see it so frequently. And I was just curious, is there any type of, how do you deal
Well,
with
not
it?
a-
And just a few comments, if you can.
I don't know. I just think I just deal with it personally to the point where I know as long as I know I go home every day, I did the best I could possibly do without violating or hurting someone or someone hurting me. I'm okay with that. I end my day like that. I think I just pray that I come home safely. I pray that I do the best I could possibly do to do my job as fair as I could possibly do it. That's it.
Rodney, real quick, and I'm just going to, I was trying to save a little bit of time, but this is a critical question too. Chaplains within the police department, after there's a killing, is there prayer with police officers or the unit? I was just curious, where does the chaplain fit in when it comes to police shootings and police killings? In particular, police killings.
If the police officer are the one who's being killed, yes, chaplain mostly involved. I think they come to the church. I mean, they come to the hospital, consult with the family. If the officer is involved and he's a victim of a shooting, he's been killed, that's when we normally see a chaplain. I don't never see a chaplain if it's the other way around. A police officer shoots someone else, and the chaplain's on the scene or goes to the hospital. It's a family individual chaplain or somebody like that would do that.
Rodney, one of my deacons at church said, God bless your whole soul
Thank you.
for this wonderful information that you passed on. And I just want to send out the condolences from Africa's Vision Network for those students and the teacher, those 10 people who were killed at Santa Fe High School in Texas. Another mass shooting. All shootings should touch our hearts and touch our mind so that we can try to make a difference. I'm almost speechless because our children in particular, we as adults, we as politicians, we are coming up short. And as I close, I want to read something I thought was very powerful from the sheriff, the Houston police chief, in regard to the Santa Fe shootings. Here's what he said. Houston Police Chief Art Acevedo said on Friday night that it's time to ask God for forgiveness for not acting to prevent school shootings after a shooting in a nearby Santa Fe, Texas high school left 10 dead. This is what he said. This isn't a time for prayers and study and inaction. It's a time for prayers, action, and the asking of God's forgiveness for our inaction. And he especially directed this to elected officials who ran to the cameras to act in a solemn manner, calling for prayers, but as this police chief said, once again, do absolutely nothing about the shooting. I want to say God bless Police Chief Art Acevedo. I may be pronouncing his name incorrectly. Because we don't hear God talked about a lot in terms of some of these events that are happening. So I just want to thank you for tuning in, and once again I want to thank Mr. Rodney Hollins for this very valuable information, and we pray that our drivers, all drivers, but in particular African American drivers, will take heed to some of this very valuable information. And thank you very much once again for tuning into Africa's Vision Network.
John Brown, gonna be some trouble there, some trouble there. Now the Harbor Ferry, John Brown, some trouble there.